Welcome to Rise and Relate with Rissa. And on today's episode, we will be discussing Indigenous people, and I want to highlight a significant story that has caught my attention and left my mouth on the floor. So, to start off today's conversation, I want to first give my condolences to Nex Benedict family. Nick Nick's benefit was found dead at his home a day after an altercation that happened at his school where he was attacked by a group of his classmates in a restroom. Nix is a 16-year-old indigenous person who used both he and him and them and they pronouns and was targeted by bullies because of his gender identity. Nick is a 16-year-old non-binary student, and this case just leaves me in complete devastation because this is the draw between what really happened to Nick Benedict and who is at fault. So, as I stated, Nick Benedict died at his home after altercation. And it can be said that he died because of the head injuries, the blood trauma to his head. But after an autopsy report, it was not indicative that that was the cause of death, but that other methods of possible suicide was on the table, where he went home and mixed antidepressants and another Benadryl medication to commit suicide, but also thinking about what led him to do that, to unalive himself, and who is at fault, who gets the charges. Regardless, those girls that brutally attacked him should be held responsible for what they did. And I think in America, it's really unfortunate that we can't press charges for the psychological and for him physical damage that is done and when it leads people to this result, because that in itself should be enough to charge and persecute someone for what they did to someone's mental well-being. So this is something that is still under investigation, and I will be monitoring closely. But it's a really sad story, and I want to talk about just the history of indigenous people and what we can do in the social work field to not continue on the historical trauma to this population of people. So, as we know, the history of indigenous people is rich, it's diverse, it spans thousands and thousands of years across like regions all around the world. Each group has its own distinct cultural language and traditions that have developed over the century. But we have to remember, again, the brutal history of indigenous people and what happened, and not to use terms that are offensive, because we like to say Native Americans or Indians, which Indians is very offensive, and even Native Americans is offensive, and they like to just be called Native or indigenous people because of the history of colonization and them being stripped of their culture, of their language, not knowing where they come from, not knowing how to get back to where their history starts, because of European colonizing and coming in and separating them and stripping them and raping them and beating them and all of the horrific things that they have done to marginalize this group of people. This group of people that have came and founded the lands that we live on. And one of the most simplest things that we can do to respect indigenous people is land acknowledgement. being able to recognize the land that we settle on, that where we live, giving homage to that indigenous tribe because they are the founders of the land that we occupy to date. And just thinking about how, like I said, the Europeans came in and they wanted so badly to strip them of their being, their just simple identity. They wanted to dehumanize this subgroup of people by separating them, by sending them to different schools, boarding schools, where they were even further stripped of their humanity, and for years to come. And though in the social work field, though we are a field that is supposed to be enriched in our social justice practices, one thing the social work field has to acknowledge is the deep-rooted racist practices that they have upheld. Unfortunately, they have upheld and contribute to the problem. And with that being said, within the social work field, it is so crucial that social workers really play an active role in supporting the Indigenous community by advocating for the rights and the resources, because still to this day, they are an underserved community. They still do not get the attention that they deserve. They still do not get the help, the resources, anything that they deserve. They are constantly fighting to be recognized as far as their rich history and being able to get social workers that are culturally competent and sensitive to the history. Because in social work, what happens with social workers that work in this population, they like to say like, hey, in the here and now, let's just move forward. And I want to prompt social workers to not be that way in the thought process, but truly allow Indigenous people to tell their story. The most powerful thing you can do is allow them to share their lived experience and not come into organizations, nonprofits, even sessions, if you work in the clinical sense, into sessions assuming that you understand their experience. Assuming that because you work with Indigenous people from different tribes that you understand what it's like, and the way you help them will be the same way that you would help the client that's sitting in front of you. So allowing them to be the experts in their experience to share what it means to be part of a certain tribe, what it means to be an Indigenous person, what it means as far as their identity. Because their identity, their self-dignity, their humanity has been stripped for decades and centuries. So for them to come to you, it's so vital that you provide a space that is so safe that they are able to heal in certain ways in order to understand what they want to do next in the light of either fighting for their rights or even in the light of them being liberated from the horrific history that they come from. So it's important that social workers recognize that historical piece, also recognize the ongoing impact of colonization, because again, they are still impacted to this day, understanding the traditional practice, which means they don't follow Western medicine, they don't follow Western narratives, they don't follow the dominant group, and really acknowledge the systems that continuously harm this group of people. Social workers can continue to serve as advocates to allow clients to have access to necessary resources such as healthcare, education, legal representation, to make sure that they get to have free housing, they get to have free education, they get to occupy their land without constantly trying to be forced out, or constantly not being represented, or constantly being overspoke by the dominant group and them speaking for them and their rights, making sure that Indigenous people have their own voice and a say in how things are done within their community and what is best to help them heal. What practices, spiritual practices or traditional practices that work in healing this community. So social workers should come from a grassroots perspective of starting with collaborating with the indigenous communities to develop programs and initiatives that meet their needs. And those needs will vary across different community groups. Social workers should support community-led solutions and empowering communities to manage their own services. So making them and empowering them to be the solution within their group while supporting them in any way possible. And then what is truly important is social workers providing mental health services that are sensitive, again, to their traumatic effects of colonization, such as the loss of their land, their culture, their identity. They should support healing from a historical, intergenerational trauma approach that integrate traditional healing practices and modern therapeutic method. This might include collaboration with traditional healers or community elders. So truly going to what they call the spiritual healing within their community and being able to integrate the two, because there's not one set way to healing and there's not one set way to how this community practices as far as who they speak to and their higher being. So just really paying homage to the way that they do it within their community. Social workers should truly be involved in their child welfare services because those social work enacted laws that was supposed to protect children, indigenous children, those laws have been shown ineffective and actually caused more harm than it did benefit them. It created more invisible barriers that made it very difficult for children to be reunited with their families, children to be able to develop back their culture and their community. And historically, indigenous children have commonly been removed from their family in many countries that have long-term adverse effects. Another way in which social workers can help within this underserved community is through the education and the training. Social workers doing direct work with communities, but being able to contribute culturally ethical trainings, culturally competent trainings, culturally appropriate practices that truly respects and honors indigenous people. And what that can look like is, again, social workers not coming in, creating these trainings based on our own research in which does not support indigenous people, but going into these communities and talking to the leaders, to the elders, to the head of the tribes, and understanding what do you guys need the society to understand and know. How do we come in with best practice? And then creating that training module or that workshop, going to educate other social workers on how to work with this population. And it always works best when you are constantly keeping them at the forefront of being the experts in those communities, and especially for those social workers that are constantly coming in, trying to provide intervention, really understanding what do they need and how do we actually work with them in complete partnership. So taking the voices of indigenous people and taking them directly to the local leaders, the government agencies, the nonprofits, and then the other service providers that are looking to help this group of people, but understanding again, that connect, not just throwing money and not just throwing resources or housing and thinking that is the solution, but looking at solutions that really help this population heal. And one thing that I've noticed in the field of social work, especially within this community and within this topic, is there is such a need for social work to have that savior complex and come into these communities and say, hey, well, we're giving you these things. You guys should be happy. You guys should move on. Let's kind of erase. And let's stop talking about the past and let's move on to the future. Not understanding how much and even how ongoing the discrimination that this population experienced. And it's hard to heal from the history when it's still happening in present day. So it's not a one size fit all, and it's not a one conversation. It's not a one intervention and now we stop talking about it. It's an ongoing discussion, and we should honor the racial rage that Indigenous people feel, because they are entitled to what they feel, because it still happens to this day. And social workers are still a part of that problem, and we need to move towards being part of the solution. And that just starts with, again, listening and letting them talk about their story over and over and over and over, because it's so traumatizing that people disrespect their names, they disrespect their land, they disrespect even the practices that we uphold in Western society that actually started from Indigenous people. So it's not a mere, it's not going to just be a race with a conversation and coming in with the simplest form of just, hey, we're giving you resources, but it's a real conversation that needs to be had. And recognizing that Indigenous people come from all around the world. They come from the Greenlands, of the Antarctic regions, from Canada, from Alaska, from Scandinavia, from Russia, and they come from some of the most extreme environments on this earth. They develop cultures deeply ingrained with the cold, marina environment, relying heavily on fishing and hunting marine mammals. So again, understanding where they come from when they come back to their land and what it looks like when it comes to food insecurity, financial insecurity, healthcare, and how they practice. Indigenous people go all the way back to Africa, the southern parts of Africa that dates over 20 years of the Masi people of East Africa that are known for their rich oral history and traditional ways that closely tied to their land and animal practices. Understanding what they still utilize to this day. Masi people, the Masi village is still preserved. You could go to East Africa, you could go to Kenya right now and stay on their reservation and learn about how they eat, how they hunt, how they speak, what they do. So enrich yourself in understanding those practices. You can go to New Zealand. And I actually met a guy by the name, I'm not going to pronounce his last name, but John G., which ironically, I was traveling in New Zealand and I was on this winery tour in Christchurch, New Zealand. And normally when I travel, this was a solo trip and I met an older Black woman, and I'm perfectly fine with just talking to and hanging out with the Black woman that I met. But we were sitting at our last winery, sharing a meal with other people that we were on the tour with, and I met John, and I don't want to botch his name out of respect, but he is a politician from Australia. and he works in the College of Education and Psychology and Social Work. And John is currently an adjunct professor at Finders University. He specializes in educational research that intersects with remote First Nation community. He supervises a number of postgraduate students and is focused on supporting publications of his student works. And he works collaboratively with researchers around Australia and is recognized for his work on red dirt thinking as an alternative to deficit understanding of First Nations education in remote communities. And talking to him, it was so profound because he showed me the people that he worked with, Indigenous people, and they all look like me. And he talked about, being a white male, and him and his wife recognized off the bat being a white male, but understand the power and the privilege and the positionality that he has in allyship to bring a face to this group of people, to bring homage to this group of people. Because he said before he was there was no research being done. There was no research really being done, and they were still being overlooked time after time. And that just warmed my heart because all these people are out there in New Zealand, in Australia, that have no home, that are lost, that are not given the respect and the dignity that they need, all constantly having to continuously relive that historical generational trauma. And it's sad to see that in 2024, but it feels great to know that John is out there doing research. And between the years of 2011 and 2016, John was the principal research leader for the Remote Educational Centers project with the Co-op Research Center for Remote Economical Participation. So over the last 17 years, he has managed a number of research and evaluation projects in remote parts of Australia with an emphasis on education and training, family services, justice, children protection, and family violence. And most of these projects that he's had have included work in remote with Aboriginal communities or in regional contexts where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stakeholders have been involved. So he is truly connecting the people with the research, with the resources, and going into these remote areas where these people have been literally completely dismissed, completely not talked about in these spaces, not recognized as even a space where they need help. So I want to say thank you to John for the phenomenal work that he's doing. And I actually look forward to doing some research as far as working with Indigenous people in Australia. And I truly look forward to us working together on a project and bringing more awareness. And that is what I plan to do in regards to Indigenous people. Because as I know as Black, as being a Black woman, how overlooked that we are and how constantly marginalized we are, I can truly sympathize with what that experience is like for them. Because the Aboriginal people of Australia migrated from Asia over 50,000 years ago. And in certain parts of Asia, especially like on that Indian strip, they look like me. I've traveled all across Asia. They are dark skinned. They look like me. They have been stripped of their traditions, and they're just trying to find home. And I know in Asia where I live now, I currently do not occupy any indigenous land where I'm actually recording this podcast from, because I do live in Japan. But the Anu people are still here. They are still actually in the southern part of Japan. They are in Sapporo, so they still do exist. I did see within the museums that they are recognized. Their history is recognized. I see that they did pay homage to the language that they brought, which is actually a very rich language and dance and culture across Japanese culture, which is just enriching to know that it was because of them that Japanese even have their culture and their language and their dance, because of the new people that are still here, but have endured some significant issues that forced them to have to migrate to places like Australia. And of course, in America, we call them Native Americans. Like I said, is a best term is First Nations. But before European colonization, these groups was characterized by a range of societal structures, from nomadic hunter-gatherer communities to highly structured societies like the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incans, with large populations and advancements um, of advanced urban architecture. So just realizing that they built our land. So for anyone out there, I just want to say thank you to all the indigenous people for everything that you have brought to our land. And I really hope that just forward thinking, we are able to do a better job at paying respect and giving you all your flowers for everything that you have done and all the ways you guys are innovative, and really embedding you all in our research, in our practice, in our newly interventions, utilizing all the ways in which you guys have healed. Like, you guys have healed on a certain level, and you guys have brought these innovative ways of spiritual healing, integrating that within social work, because social work is more acceptive into the spiritual realm of healing, especially in 2024, as we move from the typical religious way of healing to spiritual practices. So as always, rise up and relate deeply in this topic. If this is something that you are interested in, if this is work that you are doing actively within a social work field and you want to talk more about it, if I missed anything that was crucial, please reach out to me for on Rise and Relate Podcast at gmail.com for an interview for us to talk more on this topic. Thank you.